Hey, I want to welcome everybody to the Sacramental Charismatic podcast. My name is Luke Garrity, and I am a pastor theologian in Northern California, pastor at the Red Bluff Vineyard. And today I have my friend Jason DiPinto, who is a chaplain with the military, and we're going to have a great conversation. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yeah. So I think we've known each other for a few years, just mostly online, vineyard circles and whatnot. But I am so fascinated by military chaplaincy. And one of your other, I think, who's in charge of like vineyard chaplaincy? Isn't there somebody who's like the guy who is always posting?
Moved. Yeah, it's moved around. We were with Mark Fields and Vineyard Missions for a long time.
Okay.
As kind of an extension of those who are sent from the church. And then more recently, we've fallen under Josh Williams and more broadly under the sort of justice camp.
Okay.
But I think that was sort of just looking for the right home.
Yeah. It's kind of been fun, though, because I'm actually a part of one of your chaplaincy vineyard Facebook groups because I did some chaplaincy work at like a couple times for our local police. And so I got co-opted into it. But yeah, it's really fun to watch what you guys are doing. So, for our listeners, it'd be great to, just maybe share a little bit about your story. I know that you went to seminary. You've been in the Navy for quite a long time, and you have been stationed in different locations all over the world. I'm not sure if you can tell us about some of those locations because you were CIA undercover.
Yeah. No.
So like, let's get to know you. What's your story, man? How'd you come to faith?
Sure. I'll give you the, So my story is really, I grew up in a great church. My parents are both believers, and the church we went to was healthy. It was growing. It was a Foursquare church, so more broadly in the Pentecostal tradition, but had a great experience in youth group, had a strong connection to my personal faith starting at a pretty young age. My mom says she remembers me, accepting Jesus at 5 years old at a vacation Bible school, and was filled with the Holy Spirit in a pretty powerful way in high school. When I moved from California, where I grew up, to Connecticut, where I went to college, there weren't any Foursquare churches in the area, or at least none that were easily accessible. But there was a great Vineyard Church that had a cool ministry kind of bringing college students to the church. So got connected there, probably not the fall of my freshman year, but by the spring of my freshman year, which in the history of the Vineyard was actually shortly after John Wimber passed away. So I started at the New Haven Vineyard in spring of 98.
Oh, okay.
And started attending there, got plugged in pretty quickly to things like worship, and they had a strong connection to InterVarsity, and I was really active in InterVarsity all through university. Did my bachelor's degree is in political science, so all my training is in the social sciences, and had a great experience. Was really thinking I wanted to maybe do something like law or public service of some kind, considered the State Department, and ended up doing some preliminary military service, thinking that I might do military law. The idea being that would be kind of an on-ramp to public service of various kinds. Came back to Connecticut after that initial training, and moved in with a bunch of guys from InterVarsity in one of those big off-campus houses, that's kind of a classic post-college experience. Started working for an attorney, started applying to law school, and what at the time was a disappointment, but I think was God's hand, I just didn't like the work. The lawyer was a good guy. He wasn't doing anything wrong. I just didn't feel excited. I didn't feel motivated. All I wanted to do at night was come back to the house, read my friends' theology books, the guys from InterVarsity that were on staff or that had started seminary. And, we'd stay up until whatever, midnight, 1:00 in the morning, having beverages and playing Nintendo and talking theology. And I realized after a few months that I didn't have the calling that I thought I had to the legal field. And so I reached back out to the military, and they basically said, look, if you can get accepted to seminary, we'll release you from any obligation, and you can kind of move forward with whatever's next for you, And
wow.
So I got accepted to seminary the following fall, started seminary. And the nice thing about staying where I was already connected was that I was able to be in this great dialogue between my seminary studies and the life of the church, which is very thriving. So taking a lot of these things and applying them in a congregational context and an ecclesial context was really great, and the church staff helped me kind of work on things, reflect on things, and I did all the different things, helped out with junior high, helped out with high school, helped out with outreach ministry for a long time, did a bunch of different things. And then my last year of seminary, I got a partial 4-credit internship at the Vineyard Church.
Oh, cool.
So I got some partial credit. You put together a learning plan, it gets signed off on by the seminary, and then I got credit for doing that. And the senior pastor at the time, he was like, okay, we're going to read all the books and talk about all the things. And we read Alexander Venter's Doing Church. We read The Quest for the Radical Middle. We read, we reread George Eldon Ladd's The Theology of the Kingdom. We read a bunch of Wimber stuff, and just kind of talked about it in the context of the life of the church. And so once I graduated seminary, they basically brought me on staff as an associate, kind of assistant pastor position, as I was working through some ordination requirements. And then by this strange fluke, the senior pastor at the time ended up getting what turned out to be a benign but a pretty serious like a tumor, like a brain tumor. And so for a few months there was really not able to be upfront and active as he kind of went through treatment and diagnosis and all those things. And so at that point, I was helping shoulder some more of the preaching load. Of course, the elder team was stepping up as well, but they were able to figure it out by the grace of God. He's still doing great. He and his wife are doing good. And even to this day. And then as he was getting better and coming back into health, the calling or this sort of reconnection to the military that I had developed those years before sort of came back, and I was able to reach out and apply to be a Navy chaplain.
Wow. So I have so many questions about because I really appreciate you. In the past, I've just been able to message you and be like, I got questions for you chaplains. But you had actually joined the military at one point in time prior to seminary. You were actually.
I had done the preliminary training. So basically like the officer equivalent of boot camp.
Okay.
So I'd done basically boot camp. The Marine Corps has a program where you can complete that preliminary officer training, but you don't have to commission right afterwards.
Yeah. Okay.
And so At that point, I thought I was going to be on a law contract. And it's interesting because, the old-fashioned word for a lawyer is advocate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you know Spanish or French, you still see that in those languages. And I realized that chaplaincy is a kind of advocacy. Like even though the law thing had gone away, I was still there to be an advocate for those sailors, those Marines, those Coast Guardsmen, their families, whether it was an advocate before the command, an advocate before God, just to advocate for them in all those positions. And so I see in my own life and in my own personal theology, that advocacy role as being sort of a through line that continues all the way back to when I thought I would be more interested in the legal field.
That's cool. So they basically released you to be able to go follow your ministry calling, and then you discovered later that no, actually you wanted to go back into the military. So you originally had joined the Marine Corps, and then when you went into chaplaincy, that's when you joined the Navy?
Yeah. So yes, that's correct. And part of that conversation with the Marines is that the Marines, they don't have their own chaplains. The Marines and the Navy and the Coast Guard, what we call the sea services, though they all share the same pool of chaplains. And so who
are all Navy officers?
Who are all naval officers, that's right. So in my 18 years of service, or almost 18 years of service, I've served with all three of those service branches at different times.
Wow, that's cool. That's awesome. So I am so fascinated by, I guess the theology of chaplaincy or military chaplaincy. I think I've shared with you that, we have a lot of veterans in our church community. A lot of my closest friends are veterans. And a lot of the time we just sit around, having a beverage and, they're telling me stories from their service. And I'm like, oh my gosh, almost everything I watch on TV is military related. That's the type of stuff I like. My wife hates it. But so I'm just really fascinated by the military world. And I feel like, if I hadn't gone into ministry, I probably would have joined the military, there's a lot of things about that world that are just really interesting to me. But I think the brotherhood, there's just a lot of things about the teams and, the different military stories out there that I find really fascinating. But I guess, can you give us like a theology of chaplaincy? Like, what's the argument for that? I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of that just from a missiological standpoint, but just like when you're making a case for why churches should maybe invest both prayer, finances, whatever it is, like what's the theology behind what you do?
Yeah, there's so many ways to approach that, but I think as followers of Jesus and as part of the Vineyard movement of churches, right? I believe that the calling that Christ Jesus gives us is to proclaim the inbreaking of the kingdom of God to everybody, to all people, regardless of their location. And I think that exhortation is particularly strong to go outside the walls of the church. And that looks a lot of different ways in a lot of different contexts, but John Wimber is somewhat famous for saying the meat of the gospel is in the street, in other words, get out of the walls of the church. And chaplains at their most basic level are vocational ministers who serve in an institution which are not the church, but require the application of spiritual authority and spiritual leadership, not unlike what you'd find for church pastors, whether that's, doing the work that a minister would do or a missionary would do or a church planter would do, but inside an institution. And we understand this instinctively when we start to think about who we call chaplains. So chaplains work in hospitals, in prisons. They're first responder chaplains. There are sports team chaplains, right? Mm-hmm. There are even corporate chaplains increasingly. And so those chaplains are working in an institutional setting. And that institution, their mission is not the same as the church's mission. Mm-hmm. The mission of a prison is not the same mission as that of a church. The mission of a hospital is not the same mission of that of a church. But there is somebody who is brought into that institution who's exercising a vocational ministry calling in that context.
Interesting. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, there's so many thoughts that come up from that, because I think I had messaged you the first time because I was kind of curious, and I really would love to hear you share what we had talked about, just about living in the light of the kingdom and the now and the not yet in regards to weapons. Because I was kind of curious. I think I messaged you. I was like, hey man, let's say you're deployed. I'm assuming you've been deployed. You've been in Afghanistan. You've been wherever you're at, and you get into the fray of a firefight, and you're being overrun. Are you, as a chaplain, allowed to pick up a weapon and join the boys? I was just kind of curious about that. And so would you mind answering that question?
Sure.
Again, just because I thought, and also too, like flesh out like the reasoning behind what you had shared, because I thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah. This at least for me is a profound thing. And I'll give you a quick sketch of my military history and then answer your question directly. So my first assignment was with Marine Corps Infantry in 2008 and in 2009. And, that was what they were calling the surge back into Afghanistan. So there was a, preliminary fight in Afghanistan after 9/11. And then there'd been a pivot to Iraq in 2003 and 4, 5, 6, 7. And then Iraq had been a particularly difficult challenge, but there was something called the Anbar Awakening. And so that turned the tide, that allowed the U.S. military forces to take the initiative again and move people back into Afghanistan. And so the unit that I was with was part of that first surge back into Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009. I deployed with them, full spectrum counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan, came back, worked with the Amphibious Assault Battalion for almost a year, then served on 2 ships back-to-back, 2 amphibious assault ships, the USS Bonhomme Richard and the USS Essex, deployed with them to the Western Pacific, then came back and did actually almost 3.5 years bringing new chaplains into the chaplain corps. So working more on the manpower and recruiting side, like actually inviting and encouraging chaplains to join. Then I spent 3 years with the Coast Guard, and that's such a amazing ministry too, because Coast Guard, they're lifesavers, right? They're not life takers, they're lifesavers. And so they resonate with the gospel. You tell a Coast Guardsman that Jesus walked on water to pick up Peter, and they're like, man, sign me up, And then I moved back to the Navy and was on an aircraft carrier for 2.5 years. And then I spent 3 years all the way on the other side of the world in Guam as the command chaplain for the chapel there, really running traditional weekly ministry, Bible studies, praise and worship services, Sunday morning services, baptisms, baby dedications, weddings, funerals, VBS, all the things that we think of in sort of more traditional ministry. And then most recently now I've come back to California. I'm assigned to an aviation unit out of Camp Pendleton, California, and I'll be there for 2.5 years, which will take me to 20 years. And when you think about the role of chaplains, and now I'll shift specifically to talk about military chaplains, because that's my specialty and where I have sort of the most theological reflection, is I truly believe that we need, in a broken and sinful world, in a world that is full of the not yet, we need people to help keep us safe, whether that's police, fire, military. All those things are a necessary part of the world that is intrinsically filled with the not yet. But I also believe that when the Lord returns, things like the military, as we think of them, are not going to be necessary in the kingdom, in the fulfillment of the kingdom. And so, as chaplains, we have this profound opportunity to represent that not yet to an institution that is fundamentally about the now. And what I say all that to say that chaplains are non-combatants, and we are strict non-combatants, meaning we don't train with weapons, we don't qualify with weapons, we don't do all those things that you think of as being traditional military work. And many of us may own weapons in our personal lives, like in our civilian capacities. We may do all sorts of different things, hunt or whatever it is that we do. But in the capacity, in the role that we fill, in that chaplain role, we are there to represent peacemaking at its core fundamental, with a recognition that everybody around us has a different mission. You know, they may be peacekeeping and they may be peace seeking, but the chaplain gets to be the one that is about peacemaking in that day in and day out moment. And so, you know, when we go out to the field with the Marines, or when we're on board ships, or all these other kinds of things, we abstain from some of the weapons qualifications processes, not to disassociate ourselves from those we serve, but to represent a future calling and a future kingdom to a group of people that is so entrenched in the brokenness of the now that they need that symbol.
Yeah. Cause yeah, that was when we were talking, I was reflecting on that. Cause I think I had asked you, like, I was kind of curious, you know, if, you know, like if you have a situation go down, which I'm sure you've been around some of that, if you've been in those locations, you know, that you know, there would be, I was kind of curious, like, would the guys maybe respect you more if you picked up an M4 and, you know, went to town? And I think you were saying how a lot of them actually, they don't just want, but they need to have somebody that they can talk to and process with later on, perhaps even, that hasn't quite participated in that world. Is that kind of what you've experienced too, that there's a lot of you know, people that you're caring for, that they just have to have, like, I guess they want to have that that safe space maybe, or, you know, person to process with that hasn't participated in it?
Yeah.
Is that part of it?
I think there's lots of different layers. There's so many different layers to what being a non-combatant in that capacity provides. And, you know, all chaplains have to, in their own gut, in their own soul, they have to wrestle with, if push came to shove and the moment came, how would you respond? And the moment we choose to pick up a weapon, we stop being that non-combatant, which means from there on out, we're no longer going to be a chaplain. Now, we may live to fight another day, and that's a conversation that you have to be willing to have and live with. But I think for me, myself, at least from my own life, I'd like to think that I would be ready to represent that peacekeeper to the end. Trusting that to be absent with the body is to be present with the Lord, and trusting that the symbol is very powerful. As a sacramentalist, we recognize the power of the symbol to instantiate the thing that's being represented, right? So the kiss doesn't just represent the love between a married couple, but it instantiates it and it makes it real in a more powerful and profound way. And so the symbol of the peacemaker is really powerful in maintaining a moral voice, in maintaining something that you can look to and point to and say, that's a symbol of where I hope we can someday be. Now, we're all fallen and we all make all kinds of mistakes. So don't take that to be anything more than just aspirational, but we're always aiming and pointing ourselves that direction as chaplains.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this since our conversation, you know, because I think where a lot of it's just processing just war theory, and, you know, going through the process of my own journey of, you know, self-defense and, you know, concealed carry, and, you know, what are the right things. And it's like, it's so complicated, but there is such you said it, as a person who leans into the sacramental tapestry, there is power in symbols, and there's also experiential means of grace that happens within those. And I was thinking more about your answer, and it was like, there is something really powerful and profound, because I have, I mean, was it Hacksaw Ridge, or that movie with the guy? Yeah. I mean, like, that movie, I went and saw it in the movie theater, and I remember being like, dude, this is the craziest story. And then just you know, I mean, because it's true, right?
It's a true one. Yeah.
That's the craziest part. Yeah. It's like, I think I just had a lot more respect for what you're talking about, is just this. And I love the idea of, pointing to something. And then the more I thought about it, I just, I feel like some of the veterans I've had conversations with from a pastoral perspective, it's like there is something really important and necessary for them being able to process with somebody who wasn't, involved in it oftentimes. And so I was like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. So I guess all I'm saying is I'm definitely not called to be a chaplain because I am not at that stage yet, but I understand if I was, I would be that. I think it makes sense. Yeah. So
you may be closer to the kingdom than you know.
Yeah, it might be. I'm getting there.
But something I wanted to jump back on, if I may, just for a second.
Yeah, please.
The Vineyard has for its history, historically been primarily a church planting movement, and that's really a big part of who God called us to be, and I think it will always be part of who God called us to be. But that's made some of these vocational callings that sit outside of church planting a little bit harder for people to process. As a grid,
Yeah.
And so part of bringing chaplains together, you talked about some of the groups that we have, Facebook and other things, is to recognize and acknowledge and advocate for the ministry that chaplains provide. And some of them are part-time, some of them are very, casual, and then some of them, like prison and hospital, hospice, military, we're full-time. We're dislocated from our families and friends. We're exercising this vocational calling at its full spectrum. And I tell people that, you don't have to look far in the gospel. Well, and in the Gospels and in Acts to see these little moments of vocational chaplaincy. When Jesus ministers to the centurion in Matthew 8, he says, I haven't seen greater faith than this, even in the house of Israel. And that's a centurion, right? But what the centurion recognizes is Jesus's authority. And military people have that kind of recognition of authority. When Peter has the dream and the sheet comes down and back up and down, who shows up at his door but Cornelius, right? And that instance in Acts is, I think, the first instance where the Holy Spirit comes to a truly Gentile household.
Yeah.
And so that to me is a moment of military chaplaincy. And so if Jesus could connect with the Roman centurion and Peter could connect with Cornelius, and this was a hated and oppressive and external military force present in their lives, how much more can we as pastors and ministers look around us at the young men and women that leave our congregations to join the military and serve here in the United States in what's, overarchingly a democratic polity. How much more can we find space for that in our calling and in our grid? But we have to recognize and acknowledge in that the military is a distinct culture. Just like we would minister to other cultures, it's a distinct culture. You talked about the veterans in your congregation. Military people, they talk differently. We all have our acronyms and jargon. They dress differently. We wear uniforms. We move around the country differently in how we move from base to base to base. And we even have our own legal code. There's something called the Uniform Code of Military Justice that applies to military members 24/7, whether they're in uniform or not. That is an entirely separate legal code that applies to military members. And so, if the U.S. is the Athens of the modern world, it's the arts and the culture and all this sort of stuff, then the military people are the Sparta. But rather than Sparta and Athens being dislocated from one another, we're like little bits of Sparta sprinkled in Athens and all these little places, all these little highways and byways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing. So a lot of our listeners are going to be pastors and leaders. And I think that is because it really took me probably, I feel like my first 10 years of ministry, most of the veterans I was around were Vietnam vets. And so it had been out for a pretty long time, and it just didn't seem like it wasn't something that or even Korea, actually. So pretty big distance. Here, I have had a lot more people who are like, 3, 5, years out. So a lot more closer in proximity.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about how the first time I ever had any, I guess, interaction with somebody with PTSD was a Vietnam veteran who, I had a Bible study with him every Wednesday. And this is when it was actually before I was even a senior pastor. I was probably like 23 or 24. I have no idea why he would go to a Bible study with me. I was so young, but he just wanted to study the Bible. And I was like, I was I was excited to get into it. But every single Wednesday morning we had a Bible study, and the trauma and the hopelessness and the guilt that he had, and this is probably in 2005, 2004, and so that's a significant amount of time from then until when he served in the mid 60s. And I remember at the time I was like, man, I don't even think we had a grid for some of that stuff, like outside, that we didn't really know about a lot of that trauma. But I remember I was like, man, I don't even know what to do for this person, because there were times where he would just be totally overcome with guilt, from things that he participated in. But what I did see was that, because we had a group of other men that started coming, and what I did see is that when he was feeling loved and supported by these guys who were a little bit older than him, and I was obviously the youngest person there, but he just really felt like welcomed, accepted, listened to. They would pray for him. He kept coming back every single week, And so I think for pastors, a good reminder is that there are almost always veterans in your church that you might not even be aware of. And it's worth it to actually be pretty intentional with them. Cause you mentioned how the vets talk different. I've noticed they're always copying. Everything's a copy. If you say something like copy, I'm like, oh, what copy what? Or they're always heading clicks. I'm like, why are we going clicks? What is a click? So it's kind of funny, all the different language.
Yeah. And it's important for, I think, people to know too, this is something that I always want to emphasize to people. Chaplaincy at its heart, we are not expected as chaplains to become sort of generic religious people that are just sort of, generically religious. I don't even know how to put that in a more...
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because I think this is what we have heard. And I know I've been educated, so I know this isn't true, but I think a lot of stuff I heard, and this is probably a long time ago now, like 20 something years, was that if you became a chaplain, you had to sacrifice orthodoxy and you had to basically embrace Islam and Hinduism, and you couldn't talk about the exclusivity of Christ. But as you're saying, I've come to learn that that's not actually accurate, correct?
Yeah. So it's important to have this distinction. I appreciate you kind of phrasing it that way, because what I'll often tell people is that all chaplains, at least all military chaplains, are ministers before they come into the chaplaincy. They have to be. They have to have some kind of theological training, some kind of professional work as a minister. Now, chaplains come from all traditions. We have Catholic priests that are chaplains, and Lutherans and Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Pentecostals, but we also have rabbis that are chaplains, and we have imams who are chaplains, and we have a couple in the Navy, we have a couple of Buddhist priests who are chaplains. But just like your doctor is not just like a generic doctor, right? He's a internal medicine or family practice or orthopedics or cardiology. We as chaplains are expected to maintain our credentials with our sending church at every point along the way. So just like your cardiologist can't pretend to be a pediatrician, they would lose their license. For the same reason, if I had to somehow pretend to be Jewish or pretend to be Muslim to somehow officiate some kind of ceremony, I would lose my credential as a chaplain through my sending organization, which in this case is the Vineyard. So when you talk about how chaplaincy fits with Vineyard theology, John Wimber used to say, like, when do we get to do the stuff? And me as a Vineyard chaplain, as a military chaplain, but as a Vineyard affiliated military chaplain, every service I lead, I'm I'm inviting people to hear from the Holy Spirit. I am inviting people to learn to pray for each other and to, to step into maybe something like a 5-step prayer model, whatever the context would be. The services that I lead would be virtually indistinguishable from services at any other Vineyard Church. Now, when I say that, I say that all the services that I provide come from my faith group tradition. If somebody comes to me and says, I'm Jewish or I'm Muslim and I want to practice my faith in X type of way, I have to tell them, well, that's not my faith tradition. I can help you find somebody. I can help you find a chaplain that maybe comes from that tradition. I can maybe see if there's a synagogue out in town or a mosque out in town. It's not my job in that moment, working as a chaplain, to say, oh, I don't believe that. You need to believe the way that I believe. I want to, open up the Bible right in that particular moment. So what we say in the Navy Chaplain Corps is that we provide religious services for folks who are from our faith group tradition or anybody who'd like to come, but we facilitate the free exercise of religion for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be similar to like if a Muslim walked into our, my office and said, hey, do you know if there's a mosque in town? I would more than likely not be like, what? That's a terrible place to go. I'm going to probably try to help them and serve them and form relationship in the hopes that it might open up, or lead to other opportunities, or, obviously, being sensitive to what the Holy Spirit might, want right there and pray for them, things like that. It seems like what you're doing as a military chaplain is seeking to serve people where they're at. And then in addition to that too, you also have opportunities to lead services that they willingly, freely participate in, correct?
I think that's right. I might add a slight nuance, which is to say that when I was working in the church, if somebody had come in, I might be a little bit more explicit in my gospel presentation in that moment if I felt that was the moment to do that. But chaplains, all the services we provide are from our faith tradition, but we also stand as the guarantor of the free exercise of religion for everybody. That First Amendment right that we all have as Americans. But in the military, the chaplain stands as the guarantor of that religion. Of that right. The chaplain stands as the guarantor of that right. And that's important because what it means is that if I'm only in a unit for 2 or 3 years, and I've developed a thriving ministry to sailors and Marines, well, the chaplain who replaces me might be Roman Catholic, or he might be Jewish, or he might be Muslim, or she might be Episcopalian, or whatever, right? And so by extending that right and courtesy to all the Marines and sailors and Coast Guardsmen and their families, that ensures that the chaplain that replaces me will do the same thing for folks that come from an evangelical background or come from a charismatic background. And so we extend that courtesy by guaranteeing the right to free exercise for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I read that book. It Took Heroes, which is a book about a Vietnam chaplain. And I think he was Mormon, potentially. Yeah, it was a pretty popular book. I think my mom might have given it to me, but anyway, what was interesting in that book was it was, stories and just about, these veterans and how they were so brave and served and things like that. But I found it interesting that because I'm pretty sure I'm almost positive LDS, but it was listening to him talk about navigating about how serving Roman Catholics and different people. It was really an interesting book. Yeah. So, okay. When you were in Guam, I'm very fascinated by your time in Guam because it sounds like you were a pastor when you were there. I'm like, yeah, you just listed all the. So, are you doing baby dedications or baby baptisms?
So we do baby dedications, just like you would do at any other Vineyard Church. We would do creedal baptisms for anybody that was of appropriate age and had a sense of God's leading for that. But we would do baby dedications just like I would do at any other church.
So could you do? I'm just curious about. So I don't know if you're aware that there are Vineyard churches in the UK that do baby baptisms. They are heavily Anglican influenced. Is your time in Guam, is that connected to just the traditional American Credo Baptist background, or is it your personal I hate to say preference, but your personal conviction in regard to whoever's the actual like let's just say Vineyard person who is, because there are a number of Vineyard people who hold to like dual baptism or are Paedo Baptist leaning. If they were the military chaplain there in that setting, could they do them if they felt led to, or how does that work?
So when chaplains are assigned overseas, we still follow the regulations of the endorsing agency that sent us.
Okay.
So let's say, for instance, I was assigned. For instance, there's an Air Force base in England. Royal Air Force Base, Mildenhall and Lake and Heath. There's a detachment of U.S. Air Force personnel that are assigned there full time. They spend 2, 3, 4 years in this part of England. It's in Cambridgeshire. And if a Vineyard chaplain was sent there, that Vineyard chaplain would still be expected to follow the required faith traditions of their sending church.
Okay. So in this case, would that, I mean, that's kind of, I'm curious, because the Vineyard VUSA doesn't have an actual statement on baptism that would prohibit or, hold to one exclusive baptismal practice. Would that then be default would be your local church that you got ordained with before there was the national ordination?
I think so. Realistically, I think all pastors to some degree, I guess in more institutional churches, certain things are spelled out quite specifically. Yeah.
For you and I, it's less so is kind of my point, but also my question. I'm just kind of curious how that works.
But we don't necessarily do anybody any we don't serve people well, at least not in the military that way. Because then when chaplains take a stand on conscience and somebody challenges them on it, they don't have anybody to back them up. Because loosey-goosey organizations are like, you could do this, you could do that, like it's up to you, and you're like, well, and then sometimes it's helpful to outline things. And so as I have never been a part of a Vineyard church that has practiced Paedo baptism. That would be surprising to me and also a little confusing. But if you
prepare to be confused, Jason.
If you tell me they're out there, sure, I would. But you know what? There's always been lots of streams in the Vineyard, and there are always people on the fringes, and so
that's true.
It
is really interesting though, because like having the UK vineyards that tend to practice. Because there's different types of Paedo baptism, as you know, too, right? There is Roman Catholic versions, which I'm super uncomfortable with. And then there's, Presbyterian, which I'm like, okay, so we're kind of doing a baby dedication, but we're calling it a baptism, but we kind of use, it is confusing, I think. But in the UK, it does make sense just with such a strong Anglican connection there too. But yeah, I've always just kind of been curious. I think you're right. In fact, that's very interesting that in the military, the more clarity from a denominational theological standpoint would actually help you as a chaplain, I would assume more. But probably the same thing is true about pastors too, right? I mean, having some type of a confessional or, some kind of a statement of faith that we all can actually agree on is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you think about a missionary context especially, and you want there to be some flexibility to contextualize the gospel to a local context, right? So Lamin Sane was a missiology professor. He used to say, and I don't know if he was the one who developed this, but he said that one of the main differences between Christianity and Islam is that in Islam, everything bends towards Mecca. culturally and theologically, everything bends towards Mecca. Whether you're in Indonesia or in Columbus, Ohio, if you're a Muslim and you want to read the Quran, you need to read it in Arabic if you're going to read it at its heart, right? Because in Islam, my understanding is that the understanding is that the Quran is not just the word of God, but the words of God. And so everything bends towards Mecca. Whereas from its infancy, Christianity has always been eminently translatable.
Yeah.
It is the seed that is planted in the culture, and it takes root in that culture, and it will transform certain things in that culture. It will redeem certain parts of that culture, and then it will also change certain parts of that culture.
Yeah.
So, and like Aristotle used to say, Aristotle talks about a virtue as being the mean between two vices, right? So, so you hope that the transformational role of the gospel in a culturally distinct context is exactly that, transformational in light of the gospel and not syncretistic.
Yeah.
Because I hear about people, throwing on robes and baptizing babies, and to me that feels syncretistic. We're co-opting local cultures so that we don't have to proclaim the gospel. But that's unnecessarily combative, and I don't need to pick that fight. Well,
I mean, it probably is. It just kind of depends on, the situation. But that's kind of the challenge. It's interesting hearing you talk about your time in Guam. I think just because it sounds so much like, in a good way, I mean this, but it's like, it's kind of like your typical pastoral ministry challenges, right? I mean, there's a combination of your personal leadership identity as a leader. You're going to lead. You're going to follow your convictions and your conscience. You have guidelines. I mean, that's no different than every other pastor in the world too, right? And there's certain things like I'm personally less. I mean, I don't wear a robe. I'm not. It's not my thing. I don't think it's always syncretistic. I think it can be syncretistic. It's like with baptism.
Yeah.
With baptism, I'm convinced exegetically, credo baptism. I cannot get there to see infants being baptized in the New Testament, but I also I do understand the theology behind some of them, and I'm like, I wouldn't I'd be able to be on staff at an Anglican church. I'd be like, okay, cool, we're doing this Christianing, thing. But it's interesting hearing your time in Guam, because you were basically leading a church community. And so are all those people going to it? Are they all military and families of militaries, or are there people from outside of the base that are able to come too, because you guys do outreaches into the community?
What was cool about that? It was a chapel, which is a slight distinction from a church, but it was a chapel.
What's the distinction? Well, I'm curious.
Yeah. Really, the simplest way to think about it is that, at least in this context, like, for instance, the chaplain that replaced me is Free Will Baptist. The chaplain that I replaced came from a United Methodist background. So people were there who were all manner of Protestants of all flavors. But the services that I led would have felt very common in any Vineyard church. They were invited to attend, and they came because there was a strong sense of community. What was amazing about that chapel is that not only did we have Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists and Pentecostals and Baptists that were there, we also had people of all different ethnicities, of all different service backgrounds. We had a Coast Guard guy playing the bass, and we had a Marine Corps officer. His wife helped lead our children's ministry, and we had an Army colonel whose daughter sang on the worship team, and they all came together by the grace of God. Our worship leader was actually a local Chamorro woman who came onto base and just led worship with authenticity and power, but she had spent most of her life in the Catholic Church.
Okay. So there were people who were able to come on to base, pass the background check or whatever, and then come and just attend the chapel?
Yeah, it was what you mostly got were retirees, so people that already had base access. She was able to come on because we essentially brought her onto staff as the worship leader. And so we were able to sort of invest in that process for her.
That's really cool. I mean, that's kind of like because my grandpa was in the Navy, a career Navy person, and so my favorite part of growing up was going to the commissary growing up and for school shopping and all that stuff, you know. And so the last time my grandma and grandpa are now buried at the National Cemetery at the base up in Anchorage. And now it's like, man, you have to like, you know, getting onto it is so much harder, you know, to do it. So, which is good. I mean, I think that's not a bad thing at all too, but it's kind of cool to see that you could be able to, you know, have people outside and still be able to include them in that experience with the chaplain as a chaplain there. That's crazy, dude. And did you have like little lizards running around everywhere in Guam? Because that's what I've heard.
Yeah, geckos are everywhere. Yep, cool, absolutely. Cool. Yep, Guam's super tropical, and there's a wonderful Vineyard Church plant there that is thriving. A wonderful set of pastors that have been sent out from All Saints Church in Oklahoma, which is a great Vineyard Church there.
Is that the Blounts? Is that Brian?
I can't remember. I'm not. I'm going to blank on the name of the folks that sent them, but the couple that's in Guam is Mike and Jen Milner, and they're fantastic. Cool. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Cool. He's from the UK. She's from the US, and they met together and were sent out from the church in Oklahoma. But you know,
so they are planted in Guam. On the same same city as you?
So Guam is a relatively small island, but it's made up of 18 different villages. The max speed limit on Guam is 35 miles an hour. So, you know, that's the max speed limit. That's not to say everybody goes 35 miles an hour, but that's the max speed limit. And so they're about 30 to 35 minutes north of where we were living. Oh,
okay. That's not too bad. I have so many questions. This is so fun having a live human chaplain be able to ask questions. I'm just having tons of questions go through. What are some of the greatest challenges with being a chaplain? I mean, you know, when you had, I mean, maybe thinking about it from like just as a minister of the gospel, but then also too just practically. I mean, do you like moving to different countries every 2 years or being deployed? You know, what are some of the challenges compared to just in that whole vocation?
Well, there's a lot of wonderful things, but there are some significant challenges. Moving often is both great and terrible, right? Nobody really likes moving, but the experience of being in all these different places is amazing. And you have such a unique cultural experience. My wife and I traveled in Japan. We traveled in Thailand. We got to spend a week on a boat off the coast of Palau, scuba diving 5 times a day. I think the challenges of chaplaincy can mirror the challenges of a lot of pastoral ministry in the sense that our congregations or our military is a reflection of the society that we represent. So as society changes, as society wrestles with different things, the churches and the military will wrestle with the same things. Military tends to be a little bit distinct in that it tends to skew younger. So especially on the Marine Corps side, a vast majority of Marines are between 18 and 26. So if you think of 80% of your church being college ministry, you know, that's a unique challenge. Lots of time, no money. But the way that I would phrase the challenge is that, let me put it this way. I think chaplaincy is incredibly incarnational because when I put on that uniform and go to that job and cut my hair a certain way and talk a certain way, I am incarnating in that culture in a way that is, I think, creates amazing opportunities for the gospel. And I have access to men and women in their workplaces almost any day of the week. You know, when I was in church ministry, which I loved, by the way, and I hope to go back to someday, but I couldn't show up at my deacon's workplace and just start having a faith conversation at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Like he had work to do. But as a chaplain, I have access to those spaces, and I'm not just encouraged, but expected to have those conversations almost any day of the week. What I lose, though, is I lose control of the agenda. And so I trade access for agenda, because, as much as we sometimes feel as pastors that we're sort of subject to the whims of the news cycle or whatever it is, fundamentally, in discernment with God and the Holy Spirit, we control the agenda of our church.
Okay.
But I don't get to control the agenda of the Marine Corps. I don't get to control the agenda of the Navy. I don't even get to control the agenda of my unit. And so much of what I feel as a tension in chaplaincy is I have all this access, but no control over the agenda. My greatest limitation is time and resources and the agenda. It's like, so I think that's probably where I experienced the greatest tension.
Okay. That makes sense. And I know I got to meet your wife, your lovely wife in Cincinnati at the National Vineyard Conference. And you guys got married somewhat recently, right? A few years ago?
Yeah, we got married later in life. We got married in 2021, kind of on the...
In 21, okay. Yeah. So because I kind of saw it on Facebook and whatnot. So she didn't have a military background, I'm assuming. So she married a military officer and now has been traveling. What's that been like for her? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I don't want to speak directly for her. We met through the Vineyard Church in New Haven. Her family attended there for many, many years, and as I was there, and so we have a lot of like long-standing connections going pretty way back.
Yeah,
we dated for 3 years. Well, I guess we dated for 2 years before we got engaged, and then we're engaged for about a year before we got married. Again, some of that was COVID and other things. And part of our dating was long distance. When we first reconnected, she was living on the East Coast. But I think that, I mean, I don't want to speak for her, but what I
Does she like it? Here's my question. Does she like it? That's just yes or no. We want to know.
She does. I think she does. I think that what made it helpful was that as we were dating and coming together, I was already doing the things. And so she wasn't she didn't have to buy in hook, line, and sinker right away. She could observe and ask questions,
Yeah, because what I'm thinking about is, so in my context, my wife and I co-lead together. So we're both very involved in our church ministry stuff. She does the things she does, I do my things. In your quote unquote more traditional situations, you'll have one person in particular who's the ministry person, and the other person is the pastor's spouse or pastor's wife, right? I had never thought about what would it be like to be a chaplain's wife, because you as a chaplain wife could find out you're moving to Guam. That's part of the that is part of the equation. So that's got to be. I mean, it's not always easy, but obviously, it must be kind of cool too, though, in some ways too, because you get to experience. You have different experiences. I mean, that's one of the things that I've loved hearing from all my friends in the military is the travel part, and getting to hear. One of my closest friends was in the Navy for 6 years, and he. Australia, Thailand. I mean, he does everything that you could imagine, and he was really, really good with his finances, like saved all his money. So when he graduated, or when he got out, he went to college, used his GI Bill to pay for all of his school, got everything paid for, but also had like a ton of money in the bank. And I was asking him about that one time. And he said, well, yeah. He's like, when I went to Thailand, the only thing I spent money on is I went skydiving one time. And then when I went to Australia, I went, deep underwater dive. It was like he only did like one fun thing in each place, but it was like pretty cool that he had gone all these places. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So, wow, yeah. So, your wife will have to someday be on the podcast, and we'll interview her and ask her everything.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think, but think about it from a missionary context, and presumably. Yeah. Missionary families co-discern where God's leading them to go. But especially in a more traditional denomination, there may be one member of the couple that's the clergy person or whatever, the minister, and they're sort of leaning that forward.
Yeah.
There is sort of we're in this together, but it's not. The nice thing is that when the Navy calls and says you're going to Guam, the good news is there's a great community of military folks out there, and they just came from wherever they came from, Virginia or San Diego or Everett, Washington. And so we all come together for the time that God has us there, and then he sends us out.
Yeah.
I will say that, like, from a church context, pastoring a military chapel is a lot like pastoring a college church, not just because of the age demographic, but because every year about 30% of the congregation turns over.
Yeah. That would be a challenge for sure. Yeah. That's interesting because it sounds exciting. Like what I hear from you is I'm like, dude, that sounds so exciting, so fun. But I know for a lot of people, it would be like, that sounds terrible, the change and whatnot. What's been your favorite part about chaplaincy then? If you had to pick, like, what's the thing that you've loved?
I think the thing that I have loved perhaps the most, sometimes it depends on which day you ask me, but is that because so many of my predecessors have been faithful men and women of the gospel that have built trust up with Marines and sailors and Coast Guardsmen, people will walk in my office who have never met me. And I mean, like, daily. Like, I just came from a conversation today where somebody unloaded some really heavy stuff, not because of who I was, not because of the relationship they had with me, but because they saw the cross on my collar and they trusted that role and that vocation enough to open up. And we spent, 5-6 minutes in prayer. And this person doesn't even come from traditionally, certainly not an evangelical background, much less a charismatic one. But I'm praying the Holy Spirit into her house and into that life. And that happens all the time. That access that I said we get as chaplains is so profound. And when people are faithful to the calling that God's called them to, strangers will trust them with the most intense part of their lives without ever getting to know them, because they see the symbol that you represent. Again, coming back to that symbolism that can sometimes be so powerful.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I just can't say thank you enough for you taking the time to have this conversation. I mean, I've been like a distant fan of Jason online, and I've always really appreciated what you share and what you contribute. And I think this is going to be really helpful for people discerning too, maybe calling. And so, could we end with that? Could you maybe just, if there's somebody listening right now who's in discernment, and maybe trying to, get a sense of like where God might be calling them. I think sometimes it's helpful to know what the options are. You know what I mean? Like when I was praying about, where to transition to, it was helpful as we began to have a sense of like, what were our options, too. So could you maybe just share give us your elevator pitch, man. Why should somebody consider and pray and maybe contact you or whoever they contact about chaplaincy work in the Vineyard?
Yeah. That's a great setup, man. You send me the softballs right down the middle. I'll hit them out of the park all day long. What I want to say about chaplaincy is it's an extension of the calling that God's put on your heart. I don't think, at least not the way that I read the Bible, I don't think chaplaincy is a special kind of calling. I think it's an extension of the calling that God gives us to be children of God, to be husbands and fathers and mothers and daughters, and the calling to take the ministry of the kingdom of God outside the walls of the church. And rather than looking at chaplaincy as something that's way over there, and I've got to make this giant leap from where I am to where chaplaincy is, why don't we bring the boat a little bit closer to the dock and say, hey, consider reaching out to your local police or fire and seeing if they have a local part-time chaplaincy program or a hospice care facility or something like that, to see if there's a way you can get exposure to institutional ministry of various kinds, and then see if maybe God's putting a calling on you to expand that to something full-time like prison or hospital or military chaplaincy. And that would involve some additional training and some other things that you would need along the way. But it is really, the vocation is what God calls us to be ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Chaplaincy is just the location to that vocation. Honest to God, it is where it has to be. And if you're a senior pastor, especially if you've got an associate pastor, I want to invite you to consider the fact that chaplaincy is not something that's going to take that guy or gal out of your church, but is going to expand your ministry to the men and women that are already in your church that are thinking about the military or who are veterans. There was a pastor that I talked to one time who said, I've been the senior pastor of whatever, Second Baptist Church of whatever, Olathe, Kansas, wherever it was. And I've always wanted to get my church involved in the mayor's prayer breakfast and the National Day of Prayer and all this kind of stuff, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and we could never do it. But the moment I became a chaplain, they were calling me. And this guy wasn't even an active duty full-time chaplain. He was a reserve chaplain. He was doing this 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, and the city started calling him, and all of a sudden, the ministry of his church began to expand beyond the walls of Sunday morning because he had this now access and validity. And there are reserve chaplaincy options, again, especially if you're thinking about associate pastors or assistant pastors, where maybe you could support them doing 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, trusting that they're getting paid for that time, they're getting access to health care through that time at a reduced rate, they're building up potentially a pension retirement during that time, and they're coming back to you with skills and resources and opportunities that they bring back to your local church. And sure, one or two of those folks may discern a calling to active duty, but that's a discernment process. Discernment's a two-way street, And so we as pastors get to be part of shaping and cultivating, as we listen to the Holy Spirit, what God may be calling them to. But there's so many ways that chaplaincy can play itself out. And it doesn't just have to be, well, they've discerned a call to chaplaincy, now they're going to Guam for 3 years. There's so many places between here and there to cultivate and inculcate what it means to take the ministry of the gospel outside the walls of the church.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. No, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on here. And so people can obviously kind of follow some of that those steps and processes too. So, hey, man, I really appreciate you. And tell your wife I said hello. We would love to have her on, share about being a chaplain's wife. And
absolutely.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Yeah.